Executing a value add multifamily strategy. Hey everyone, welcome to this week's video. We're going to focus today on what it actually takes to lay out a plan and then execute on it for a multifamily apartment building. And we're specifically talking about value add with renovations bringing rents up to market rates. So for some of you who may be looking at the multifamily world from the outside in, you may see people talking about buying this property and then it's spitting out this amount of distributions to their limited partners and themselves, but it's not always clear what goes on in between. And I'm going to lay out a strategy. It's not the only strategy for value add, but it's a very common one. And for those of you graduating from the fix and flip single family home space and looking at your first multifamily, it could be very useful just to break it down and see how does this actually work. So it's a step-by-step guide. I'm going to start at the very first, which is identify a property. Makes a lot of sense. Without a property, you got nothing to execute upon. So whether you find your property through brokers, on market, off market, maybe you find it yourself directly contacting a seller, maybe you know some people who have multifamily properties that they're looking to offload. You have to identify the property and then you have to actually get it under contract as well. You have to negotiate and settle on a price and terms with the owner. So that's pretty straightforward and obvious. So we're going to jump into number two is compile the capital stack. So because we're doing a value add strategy here, we're actually going to use short-term debt. The debt I've seen used a lot is bridge debt. And really what that means is it's probably a 1 to 2 year period where a lender will issue debt and it's typically interest only at a higher interest rate. So now we're in 2025, I've seen bridge debt anywhere from call it 8 to 11, 12%. You can think of it as hard money, although hard money for single family houses typically, well in the teens now. So bridge debt is usually a bit cheaper, but it is higher than if you were to go get an agency debt or just regular CMBS mortgage. But what it allows you to do, it has interest only payments, which means that your cash flow can be a bit stronger. But more importantly, it doesn't have prepayment penalties, which a lot of longer term debt has. So the point is that we're going to, not to spoil the ending, but we're going to get the property financed with the bridge debt. We're going to do the value add. We're going to refinance out into long-term debt, and then we're going to exit the property. So I'm just going to go in a bit of detail over each of these steps here. So we have the short-term debt. The kinds of lenders who lend to this is pretty atypical, I would say. You get a lot of private lenders. I've seen a lot of private wealth funds who they target specifically bridge debt. And if the operator defaults, they're more than happy to take over the project because they know they've got a good deal. You'll also see some higher leverage in this kind of debt. So it is two very different types of debt that you're looking at between short-term and long-term, which we'll get into a second. The second part of it is equity. So the debt that you're getting is going to probably cover, 70, 75% maximum. Of course, in different environments, you can go higher, and of course, you can go lower all the way down to zero. But assume you're starting out, you're going to try and make the most of the leverage you have available to you. And so you're going to have to come up with, let's just call it 30% of the value in equity. So if you buy a $10 million deal, you're going to get financing for 7 mil, and you're going to need to bring up 3 million in equity. So you may either have that yourself, if you do, good job. Most of you out there won't. And so you may have to bring in outside sources of capital. So it could be friends, family. You could raise it from people looking to invest in these kinds of projects passively. And we call them limited partners. In this scenario, you would be the general partner where you're executing on this strategy, and the limited partners are bringing to the table the capital needed. So you've got to think of those two parts, the short-term debt and the equity. And next step is to actually close on the property. So you take ownership and then implement your management. Now, management can often be an afterthought for a lot of operators. They either just hire a third party management company, or they just try and do it themselves. This is one of the biggest value adds you can actually bring to a property these days. As I said, a lot of people treat it as an afterthought. But if you're really on top of management, if you understand where the revenue is coming from, if you understand the tenant base, where some of these expenses could be trimmed down without compromising the value that the property is bringing to the tenant base, then you can really create a lot of value in the property without even renovating a single unit. So focus on that, closing on the property, then implementing your management. That is a huge key, which a lot of people will gloss over. So good tip for you there. Number four is actually complete the value add. So when we're talking about value add in multifamily properties, we're typically talking about doing some sort of renovation, especially the interior renovation. Now, we spoke last week about doing interior renovations. You can actually bump the rents up. Obviously, a nicer place is going to command higher rents. So this is more or less where your value add is going to come in. You're going to go into a unit that's either recently vacated or the lease has come to an end. And usually you start with the oldest and ones in worst shape with the lowest rent, and you renovate them. And we've talked about the renovation before. You're doing renter grade materials, but you're making it look nice. It's homely. It's somewhere where someone would pay a premium to lease over other units in the property. So completing the value add is where you're really adding value. And when you come to distribution time, a lot of that, I mean, it's really correlated to how much value have you added to the building, both in management and in improving the property itself. Number five is refinance into long-term debt. So now you've completed the value add, you've made the property worth more, considering you've assuming that you've done the value add in a good way and it's increased rents. The value of the property should be more, so you can actually refinance now into long-term debt. So what this means is that you're actually going to, you know, approach a more traditional lender who it could be agency debt with the lowest interest rates possible. You will have these prepayment penalties. However, your plan is to now hold the property for the longer term, and depending on your investors and what was agreed to before, it could be 5 years, could be 7 years, could be longer. But you now no longer have this higher interest rate debt. So and you have increased rents on the building. Your management has decreased expenses. So now you've created a kind of arbitrage where you have low debt payments every month, and then you've got higher income coming in, and that cash flow is actually where you're really going to see a noticeable difference in distributions you're able to pull out of the property, at least from a cash flow perspective. Now, obviously, the property is worth more once you do the value add, so you can do a cash out refinance, and especially if you have investors and you want to get money back into their hands, doing a cash out refinance can definitely quicken that process and get some more money in their pockets, and maybe allow them to invest in other deals that you have. Or if you're just financing the equity portion completely yourself, yeah, it might allow you to go and do other deals. So the cash out refinance is very common. Obviously, the more you cash out, the higher your debt payment is going to be. So if your goal is to cash flow and you just love building up this cash flow over years and years, then the lower debt and maybe just doing a refinance into a lower interest rate at the same amount of principal is the right move. But refinancing into long-term debt gets you to that path where you can actually cash flow pretty nicely. And then the last step is the exit and the distributions. You've gone through all the previous 5 steps, and now you're ready to either sell the property, and this is maybe a little bit more of an advanced step, but recapitalizing the property. So if you've brought on investors and you said, "Hey, I'm gonna give, get your money out in 5 years," and 5 years has come up, you don't necessarily need to sell the property. You can actually have it recapitalized. You might say, "Hey, I'm starting this new fund. I'm gonna have this property sold to that fund." So it is technically a sale, but you can offer the opportunity for investors to roll their money in to that fund, or if they want to cash out, they would get the money from the sale proceeds to the fund. And of course, the pricing is determined by an appraiser or even multiple appraisals to make sure that everything is fair on that end. But that is effectively from start to finish a very high level, broad plan of how you'd execute a value add multifamily strategy. Now, of course, some of these steps could vary. For instance, you may want to raise the capital for the renovations themselves. And if you do that, that means that you could just get long-term debt from the very outset. You don't need to do that refinancing step. Obviously, that means that you need to raise more capital, more equity. And if capital is your limiting factor, if that's your bottleneck, then that might not be an option to you. But more or less, any value add multifamily strategy will follow a series of steps like this, and a majority of them will be like the specific one you're seeing here. And that is how you start from, "Hey, I found this property," all the way to, "We return this IRR to investors." So yeah, broad from now. In the following weeks, we're going to go more into detail about some of these specific steps, how you can optimize them, how you can fine tune them to get squeeze every bit of juice and value out of each of these steps, and absolutely maximize the amount of investment returns you can get on a multifamily property. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.